My name is Maura Charles. I have about 20 years of experience in product roles, product-related roles, similar to product roles, not necessarily called product, but definitely product. And I have been in a lot of different industries. So, I love switching industries. I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. But I actually, when I get kind of like, it's into a role for a while and say I've been in industry for 4 or 5 years and I see something interesting somewhere else, it's like been a really great opportunity for me to kind of like flex my chops and learn how to do what I do in different industries. And so, I've been in media, a lot of content sites, some nonprofits. I worked for the New York Philharmonic. I ran the NBC Olympics. I ran a section of the NBC Olympics website back in 2004. So I've done a little bit of everything. I'm currently the head of product at Spotlight, which is a website that's really designed to help educate consumers about medical aesthetics and advanced skincare. It's part of Allergan Pharmaceuticals, so it's really focused on helping people understand what like all the different injectable drugs and things like that, cool sculpting, all that kind of stuff, so that they can really educate themselves about what they might want to consider as a treatment. And I love giving this talk because wherever you go, constraints are a constant. They're in every field. I'm going to go through a lot of examples, but you're going to be you might even be surprised by some of them. It's something that as I did my research, I found was even wider than I was expecting. So I'm going to start out by telling you a story. About, sometime in the middle of last year, I found out that one of my favorite yoga teachers was doing a retreat and she was going to go to Costa Rica. And so I don't know why, but I immediately was like, well, I have to go on this retreat. Everybody needs to get away. I want to go to yoga. So I booked this retreat, not thinking much about anything, and just was really excited about it. And so, about 6 weeks before the retreat, I got sick. I got one of these really bad upper respiratory infections that you get in the fall from allergies and everything, and it just wouldn't go away. And then it turned into asthmatic bronchitis. And then I was like, oh my God, I can't even breathe. I can't, I'm like wheezing. I have all these kind of crazy symptoms and everything. I went to urgent care 3 times, finally went to my GP and I was like, I have to go on this trip. Like, you don't understand. I have to go on this trip. And everything I needed. And I kind of got it under control. And about a week before the trip, I was like, okay, I think I could do this. I'm going to go. They cleared me. They said, go. So the big kind of central, kind of activity for this trip was this tour of a waterfall. Most of the group there was 17 of us. Hardly anybody knew each other. And when we got there, we were like asking questions. What's this waterfall going to be like? What do we have to wear? What's your, all that kind of stuff. So I had been in a little bit of a panic about it because I thought I've just come off this bout of asthmatic bronchitis. I don't know if my lungs can even handle it. I have this massive fear of falling. I don't know. Some people are afraid of heights. I'm afraid of falling. And I'd just never done anything like this before. So I was a little bit daunted and, a little bit freaked out by it. So when you hear this story, really, like, those were the 3 things that for me were like my constraints. These were the things that I saw as like, I don't know if I can do this. These are the reasons why. And I kind of like had ideas in my head about how I could mitigate them, but I wasn't sure yet. I talked to the guy who was going to give us the tour. He's like, oh, no problem. You're going to be fine. And then we got there and this is literally like, I don't know if you could see this. It's a little hard to see, but it's literally rocks and water and rocks and water. We walked up a river. We basically hiked up a river for an hour and a half. Has anybody ever done this before? No, nobody. You have. Okay, good. So we have one. So this is a thing apparently that people do, but it's in the middle of the jungle. We had driven 3 hours from the small airport to where we were staying. This was another hour and a half away. So we were really in the middle of the jungle. There were no tourists anywhere. It was just us. And none of us had ever done this before except for the guy who was leading us, thankfully. So we got there, and what I realized was that, first of all, half of this stuff was in my head, and the ones that weren't were things I could manage, right? And so when it came down to it, the Costa Rican air was amazing. Like, you get there and like you can breathe. Even if you don't have a breathing problem, you can breathe better. You get there and you're like, oh, I'm not in New York. I can breathe. So it's humid. It was warm. It was just beautiful. I felt great. Fear of falling. You know what I realized? I was like, I really want to do this. When I get to the end of this, there's going to be this amazing waterfall. There's going to be this cold pools. And by the way, it was like, it was really hot. So we get there and this water is ice cold, but it felt amazing when we got up to the top. And then, I really got to kind of check something off my bucket list. And the third was the lack of experience. Honestly, it was really just a fear of the unknown. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't have any information. And so I think I was just a little bit kind of, the lack of experience was really something that I just didn't know. And now I know. So now I can go on another waterfall tour. So the reason I tell you that story is just to let you know that, that this is something that's like part of everybody's like, that's just part of life. Whether you come across them in your personal life or in your business life or wherever you come across constraints, there's something that's manageable. We're going to talk today about tools. We're going to talk today about things that you can do to really kind of make them something that that you can have perspective about and that you can really come to terms with yourself. So I pulled a couple different definitions of constraint as I was doing my research, and so we've got a limitation or a restriction. That kind of seems obvious. Something that controls what you do by keeping you within limits. Makes sense, right? And then, the state of being checked, restricted, or compelled to avoid or perform some action. Does this sound familiar to everybody and what you do? Just a bit. Great. So then this is cool. Have you guys ever played with this on Google? This is such a cool tool. So this is basically, they've indexed books. So Google Books has done this indexing of all of these words and basically said, this is how many times we've seen this word used. This is when it kind of upticked. So you can see it really starts to go up at the late, like in the 1950s and in the 60s, and it really kind of takes off. This really coincides. I did a lot of really cool research about this. This really coincides with kind of like the modern era of business thought. This is when like people started writing books about business management. This is where in the 60s was when the Project Management Institute came into being. So this is a period where like people were really starting to think about how they did the work that they did. I think before then it was just kind of a lot of willy-nilly. I don't know. Let's see what works. So this is like a time when people were really starting to think about like how they were going to do things and how they were going to work within constraints. And so I think that has a lot to do with kind of how that got used. And then this is like familiar to everybody. So if you've ever taken a project management class, you know that this is kind of the standard, triangle of constraints. You have to be within cost, within scope. You have to, the scope has to be exactly right. You have to meet a deadline, and it can't cost more than what you've budgeted for it. Quality is kind of something that's been added, I think, more recently to this. It didn't used to be one of those things that mattered until a lot of people were like, quality is kind of in the middle of all this. So, an example of this would be like a major e-commerce retailer has a budget of $1 million to build a search engine and a good user experience within 6 months. That would be like an example of how you would do that. So where do you find constraints? Across professions. We are not alone. We're not alone in products. This is everything. I have friends who are lawyers, obviously tons of constraints there. I have friends in all kinds of industries that I've talked to about this, and they all feel the same way. They're like, yes, there's 1,000 things I hate about, this. I can't do this. This makes it harder to do my job. And across industries is what I was saying before. Like, I used to think that whatever the thing was that was keep making my job so challenging, whatever constraint was really a challenge for me, was like the worst thing in the world. And it was so frustrating. And if I just switched to another industry, it wouldn't be a problem and I'd be fine. So we all know how that works out. When I worked for there was a media company I worked for, and the constraint that made me the absolute craziest at this job was how many ads they needed to put on the page. So they do all these calculations and they figure out, in order to make our revenue goals and based on what our traffic projections are for this year, we have to have X number of ads on every page view. For us, that number was 13. Yeah. So you can imagine we were the people and anybody who cared anything at all about the consumer, about the user, about UX, any of those things was just horrified by this notion. So we started to poke holes in it. We're like, this can't be. Number one, this can't be. And number two, how do we poke holes in it? So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But, I guess I just wanted to get a sense from you guys, what kinds of things in your work frustrate you, make you crazy? Go ahead.
Managing up and needing, essentially buy-in from a variety of stakeholders who may or may not actually have a stake in the product that is important to them.
So it's like a process. It's like a process constraint. Okay, great. Any other kind of constraint? Yeah. Yep, definitely. Oh my gosh, I have that in here. I put it in. I added that last night. I swear I did. Yes, we've always done it this way. It's a terrible, terrible constraint. Yeah. It worked. We liked it. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Those have been great examples. So, ooh, this didn't all load right. Hang on a sec. We're missing some. There we go. So, I pulled together this list. I did some interviews. I talked to some folks. I put them in these groupings. This is one construct you can look at where it's like they're input constraints, things that are part of your, like one of your, things that are part of your inputs. Output constraints are things that are like what the product itself needs to have as part of it. And then process constraints are things that change the way you're doing the work, or that limit the way you're doing the work. And so there's probably a lot more than is on this list, but the reason I pulled this list together is to show you that like there are all kinds of things on here that you wouldn't even think about. There are also things on this list that are not necessarily what you would think of as a constraint. Maybe they're more like a goal, right? So, or like an asset. I think there's so something like, I don't know if I put it on here, but there's like, let's see, technology. Technology isn't just a constraint. It's a tool. It's an asset. It's something that you use. But I think, the thing that really kind of struck me about this list is that there are just so many different things and not everybody's going to agree on like what a constraint is and what's not, but there's a lot of them out there. And all these things encompass like 1,000 other constraints, right? So technology could be what software, what coding languages are you allowed to use? What platform do you have to use? What third-party tools are already integrated? What legacy systems are there? All that kind of stuff. And don't discount the emotional ones. I mean, in my story that I told you guys, like, the emotional stuff is like very real. It really affects the team that you work on. It can really affect your own way of looking at things. I mean, it definitely has for me, and it's taken me a long time to kind of get to that point. The other one I think is really interesting is cultural constraints, because I feel like, especially when you work with distributed teams, you work with different countries. Like, there's definitely like different ways of doing things, and I've learned a lot about that process. There's an assumption. I don't know if everybody feels this way. I felt like there's always an assumption that constraints are bad. Constraints are a bad thing. It's like a dirty word, right? These are the kinds of things that I hear all the time. My team is so frustrated with this. Why do we have to do it this way? This rule is so annoying. We could get so much done if we didn't have to do it this way, all those kinds of things. I like this one. That's ridiculous. It can't be true. I say that probably at least once a month. Or forget it. Let's just not even do it, because we don't want to deal with it. It's such a hassle. Let's just like ignore this thing and move on to something else. Things sound familiar, I can say. Here's the reality check is that constraints are liberating. They actually give you a lot of tools to work with. They can drive innovation. They lead to creative thinking. And, my belief is like narrower scope creates efficiencies, right? If you are not building things that are not going to ever be able to be launched, you are not wasting anybody's time. We used to have these features where, so everybody gets a vote, every stakeholder gets a vote. And when you narrow it down to like, this is realistically what we can do. And that's where those goals and the outcomes and all that kind of thing that you guys hear about all the time in product is super important. And that's an output constraint. Those are all things that can really help you get to where you want to go. This is super interesting. There's a study that was done just a couple of years ago where they actually reviewed 140 something studies on the affective constraints on creativity, and they found that they actually do drive innovation. They drive creativity, and everybody benefits from it. It's only when you have way too many constraints and you can't actually get anything done that is a problem. But otherwise, it's really about just like how we look at them. So what if we change the way we look at them and flip it on its head? I love this quote from Igor Stravinsky. There's tons of examples in the arts of this, of constraints. So Stravinsky believed, and this quote goes on and on. It's actually really, it's an interesting section of the book. But he talks about, does everybody know who Stravinsky is? He's a Russian composer, early 20th century. He talks about how constraints actually invigorated him and really helped him to create. There's also this amazing example, and I'm going to ask for a volunteer in the audience. James, would you read the poem on the left for us?
No one is going to rescue us but us.
And art is 99% robbery. So this is an artist. Has anybody ever seen this before? This artist, he's a New Yorker. He wanted to see his name's Austin Kleon. He wanted to see what he could do within the constraints of trademark law and copyright law. And so what he did was he took articles, things that were already in the newspaper, and he just blacked them out. It's called the newspaper blackout. That's the name of the book. He actually published a whole book of these. But so he basically like skirted copyright law to try to figure out if he could make art out of it. There's tons of examples in art about different things that artists do to come up with creative things. I thought, just Google it. There's so many, just Google constraints in art and you'll see what I'm talking about. Some really great examples out there. But the one I really love is Amazon, and the company we all love to talk about, but they're huge. They embrace, they're an example of a company that really embraces constraints and has from the beginning, and culturally and from like end-to-end leadership from every person in the organization. They're designed around constraint. So look, we all know Bezos always wanted this to be an everything store, but he started with books, right? You have to start somewhere. You have to start with an MVP, narrow your focus. And we all know where they ended up. So they've got wind farms, which was a new thing I learned about. The robotics, I know somebody whose son works in supply chain for their robotics division. I'm like, I didn't even know they had a robotics division, but of course they do. So the constraint mindset that they're really focused on is around their meeting culture and around the value of being frugal. I know I love this quote. Does everybody know this quote?
No.
So I'll say for the folks who are watching online, it's the 2 pizza rule. If a team can't be fed by 2 pizzas, the team is too big. And so for them, that was, I think, 10 people is what they figured that the team size should be. So really, it's one of the ways that they keep things moving. It's one of the ways they keep innovating. It's one of the ways they stay nimble and stay creative. And I'm sure you've all heard that they don't use slides for meetings. They don't want presentations. It doesn't like decks. And so they have like a 6-page narrative that the executives are expected to read before they go into a meeting with Jeff Bezos. And the other thing, and this is actually on their leadership principles on their public website, that frugality is literally a value that they have. And they say constraints breed resourcefulness, self-sufficiency, and invention. And there are no extra points for growing your headcount, budget size, or fixed expenses. It's so obvious, but not everybody works this way, right? This is something that they've decided as a corporate value is really important to them, and it's helped them get where they are today. So as you can see, there's huge potential in embracing constraints. My personal take on this is like positivity is better than dread every time. I wasted so many weeks worrying about that hike, and it was one of the best experiences in my life. Using awareness of your constraints to drive that discovery and innovation that we were just talking about. Knowing your constraints gives you somewhere to start, gives you some place to start experimenting, and then brainstorms with constraints give you things that you can actually act on today, right? It's a waste of everybody's time, and then the people who had the ideas feel frustrated that their ideas weren't used. Don't do it. Don't do it. If you constrain them from the beginning, they say they feel good about the results that come out of it, and then you actually build the things that everybody came up with, and it's just a different conversation. So this is another book that came out. This is actually it came out a couple years ago. If you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend either reading the book or go to their YouTube channel. They have interviews with all of the people that they talked to for the book. Such a great story. So what they did is they looked at all different industries, and they looked at how constraints really helped people create. And now they have a consultancy where they actually do that in their work, and they actually use it to workshop. They talked though about mindset, and this is something I think is incredibly important in your personal lives and your work. The thing where, that slide about what's the thing that makes you crazy. Like for me, there have been times in my career where these constraints have actually made me crazy to the point where I didn't behave the way I wanted to behave. And I thought, oh, this isn't who I want to be, right? I was letting it take over. So I think that there's, that's like, a lot of that's this victim mindset. So like if you start to hear yourself saying things like, I don't understand this, this is frustrating, I'm annoyed, that's just a place you don't want to be. And so that's an opportunity to kind of like recognize it and take some mindfulness and take a moment to figure out why it's bugging you and what is it really and is it real? So what they talk about is that really there's neutralizers who kind of like try to get around it. They try to still meet their goals, but they don't really hit the problem head on. And then the third is transformers. And that's what we're talking about here today, which is take this, turn it into something that you can really use and make it something that's actually got a lot of power. So we'll be happy to know that there is a 6-step process that I've come up with for this. I was going to talk about time later, but I'll actually talk about it now. This can happen in like 5 minutes. This whole thing could happen in your head in 5 minutes. So I don't want you to be daunted by this. Or it could be something, if it's a bigger deal, if it's something that has been going on for a while at your company and it might take some time to break it down. Maybe it does take a couple of months to really get all the way through it. but it's something that you kind of chip away at over time. We'll go through each one of them. So, identify your constraints. Okay. So this one's pretty obvious, right? Figure out what's really going on. Write down things. This is something you can do all the time, but I would actually recommend that you kind of just do it all at once if you can. And then as you see new ones, you bring them in. Write them all down. Rank them in order of how much they're actually impacting your work. How much are they impacting the team? Are they impacting morale? Are they impeding your ability to actually get anything done or to build features that are really meaningful? Document the specifics. Validate them. Make sure that they're real. This is super important. Write it all. The part of the reason you're writing this stuff down is just so you can get it out of your head. But then once you do that, make sure they're real. Talk to your manager. Talk to your peers. Talk to people in other groups. If you work in a big company where there's lots of product groups, this is a great opportunity to compare notes. We used to do this all the time when I worked at Time Inc. We would be, you would say, they told us we had to do this. Did you guys figure out how to handle that? And then you'd go to this other group, and often, almost all the time actually, they had figured out something that we hadn't thought of. It was a great way for us to compare notes and to figure out how to make it a manageable constraint. And then this is kind of back to the examples that we were just showing in the arts and at Amazon, invent some constraints. If you don't have any constraints, you go through this whole list and you're like, actually, we can pretty much do whatever we want. You might actually need some to get to a place where your team can feel the energy of having something that's keeping them in some kind of scope. If a lot of, if you ever, I don't know if everybody's ever tried to found their own company, but starting from nothing, you could do anything. It's okay, what do I do? So giving yourself something to focus on gives you a place to start. So I pulled in examples for all these. Won't spend too much time on them, but using that example of the media site that relies on ad revenue, maybe your biggest constraints are traffic goals, all the established technologies that you're working with. Work at a big company, you're not going to be able to change out a lot of that stuff easily. Third-party algorithms. How many people rely on traffic from Google or Facebook or different news sources? Brand integrity. This is one that I find really has been important in my career. Brand integrity is a value and it's a goal and it's not something that everybody in the organization is going to think is important, but it is. If it's important to the brand and it's important to the team, it's a constraint. You have to consider it whenever you're doing something like putting 13 ads on your pages. Resources are, almost always an issue, right? It's not always just about, this is on that earlier chart. It's not always just about the number of people you have. It's, do you have the right people in the roles? Do they know how to do this? Do they have the expertise? Do they have the training? Do we need to borrow resources? Do we have to share resources with another team that we didn't even know we were going to have to share resources with? And then legacy content. This one's been here for some of my former colleagues. Having content that's been around for a while is huge. It's great for SEO. It's terrible if you're trying to innovate. If you want to suddenly have big, beautiful images on your page and you've got a 300 by 400 image and that's all you have, and you've got 50,000 of them and you have to go back and find all those images, not going to happen. You have to solve for both situations. Happens a lot, actually, in media. Okay, so stress test your limitations. This is my favorite part. As product managers, this is probably going to be your favorite part too. This is the part where you get to poke holes in it, right? You get to say, is this real? Is this a real thing? So, use what you know to ask tough questions. If you're new to product, this could be a little bit more challenging. You might not know which questions to ask yet. You might be afraid to ask questions. You might be afraid to rock the boat. Don't be afraid. You have to ask these questions. Asking these questions makes you a better product manager. Do competitive analysis. How are other companies solving these problems? Talk to your peers. I talked about this before. Talk to your peers. See how they've solved these problems. Define the boundaries of the constraints. Find those gray areas. So you want to find boundaries and then you want to find gray areas because the gray areas are really where you can do some creative stuff. Does anybody know this story about Amazon and the 10 book minimum order? So when Amazon first started, they had these booksellers that would require them to put in a 10 book minimum order. They didn't stock everything, right? They were ordering stuff as they needed it. So somebody ordered a book. They said, okay, we'll order that book for you and then we'll ship it. So what they figured out was that they couldn't afford to order all 10 books from this bookseller because they didn't know when they'd sell the other 9. So instead of ordering 10 of the same books, they would order the one book that they sold and then they would order 9 copies of a book that was out of stock And it was always out of stock because it was like a super obscure book about lichen, apparently. and this is real. This is like absolutely true. This is how they figured out how to solve that problem. I don't know how long they had to do it. I'm sure at some point they had enough volume that they didn't have to worry about it anymore, or they figured out drop shipping. But it's like a really, it's a little shady, but it's a creative solution, right? They figured out, they're like, we need to get this book out. How do we do it without taking on massive debt? This is how we do it. Diffusing negativity. This is what we were talking about early on, like being positive and having, like, there's a lot of power in positivity. If you go into something with a negative attitude, not going to be able to solve it creatively. So I really, think that neutralizing this constraint, like taking away any negative power it has. If you're feeling really frustrated with it, if somebody on your team is feeling frustrated, try to figure out why and try to get to the bottom of it. If it's something that's bothering you, it's a little bit easier because you can deal with it yourself. Really ground yourself in like a reality. Try to practice. This is all stuff that's in mindfulness. If you haven't done any mindfulness practice, it's really valuable in our work, I find. It can help you figure out what's real and what's in your head. And it's so valuable to take a breath. I remember I told somebody on my team, last year, I remember telling her to like take a breath before she like did something. She looked at me, she's like, what do you mean take a breath? You keep saying that. And I realized I was just using this yoga meditation language that I had like seeped into my head. But it's important, right? Like we're working like a mile a minute sometimes. How often do you even take time to think, oh, what are my constraints? Nobody's taking time to think about that. Taking a breath and actually thinking, not only like, is this real, but like, how do I feel about it? Why do I feel like this? Why is it so frustrating? And then the other thing I would do is find parallels with things that have helped you in the past. But this one, just figure out ways that can make it a positive. And I have this in the next slide, but I'll mention it now because it came to mind, is finding like when you're reacting instead of like responding, that's where like not just the negativity comes in, but that's where you can get yourself in trouble. That's where you can be seen as like somebody who isn't a team player. And that's really tricky stuff. You just have to try to keep yourself out of that world. I've seen it really like bring people down. So this is a couple of interesting examples here. I actually, was giving this talk to a, smaller group, and we were talking about time zones. We were talking about distributed teams in different time zones. Does anybody work with teams that are in multiple time zones? Okay, great. Somebody want to tell me like what it's like? What are the good things about it? What are the bad things about it? Go ahead.
We actually now have two development teams in two different time zones that are one in India and one in Russia and Belarus. So they're finishing or done their day.
So they're like stacked. They're closer to each other.
So we're coming in.
And you're hardly in with either of them.
We just make the Belarus and we don't really make
Interesting. So what's hard about it?
That when we're on site team, or even to some extent with the local team, we have more opportunity to really dig into requirements, walk through tickets, answer questions. But that same time that is not there, they're kind of left with just what they have.
Yes.
Jira or your
Yeah. So your documentation has to be even more clear.
Exactly. And left up to interpretation, which come in the next day may not have been interpreted the way it would have been if you had that chance to have it.
Right. Any others? Any other examples? Yeah.
What's like in localizations? We have the overseas content. So the challenge that is that if you need to fix on something, you need to take the time to what thing and what the article.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't, you have to like route really like going on and
Yes. So that's really interesting. That's totally true. So what I talked to this team who has offices in Europe and has offices in New York, and what they told me was they actually love it. And I was surprised because when I've worked with, even just with like a West Coast, East Coast world, it doesn't always work that way, right? Like sometimes people are scheduling, 8 o'clock Eastern meeting, and you're like, but I've been here since 8 a.m. Why are we scheduling all these late meetings? And the culture isn't really set up for that. That's really what matters, right? When you set up a whole company with the plan that the culture, that is part of your culture, and we're going to accept that we have these distributed teams or localized teams, it's different. And you start to value that time that everybody's not all in the office at the same time, because you know what? You're not in meetings. You're not in meetings if everybody's not in the office. So that's 3 hours maybe. If it's just East Coast, West Coast, maybe that's 3 hours that you're not in meetings together, and then you can figure out other ways to collaborate. I also find that from what I've talked to people that The companies where it works really well, they've invested in tools, right? They've invested in tools, they've invested in process, they've invested in getting the full team together once or twice a year, in a central location so that they are all like getting FaceTime together and they're all kind of getting more friendly. I thought that was a really interesting one. It's something that I always assumed was just a negative, but there's definitely some positives. And then accept them. Okay, so once you've diffused something, this is basic psychology, right? Once you've accepted, once you've diffused the power, the negativity's gone, you're like, okay, these aren't so bad, I think we can work with these. Now you've accepted them. They're a fact of life. Consciously accept them. You're going to save all this time that you were swimming upstream, trying to solve problems that you didn't really need to solve. Transform them by using positive language. Like, call them business goals now. Stop calling them constraints. Now that you've like gone through this exercise, they're no longer constraints. They're part of your process. They're part of your goals. And I say put them in your personal annual goals as a challenge. So if it's appropriate, if it's something that's so important to your business that it's really like central, say, I'm gonna work actively at solving that this year, and here's how I'm gonna do it. And then at the end of the year, look back and make sure that you've documented that. There's a couple of great examples in here, but honestly, if you just kind of like start searching around it, I love this example about Audi. Does anybody know anything about Formula One racing? So there's all these amazing constraints that they put into place. But the one that was the most interesting to me is that there's only there's a max speed that you can make a car go, and there's max horsepower, I think. And so what that meant is that if you wanted to win the race, you had to win it some other way. You couldn't just make the fastest car. You had to figure out other things to do. So Audi figured out that they could make the car more fuel efficient by making it diesel. So they had one of the first diesel, I think, Formula One cars, and they won. They won like 4 years in a row. They won. And so, at Le Mans. And so they also, this is super interesting. They found when they did that, they invented a bunch of other things that they could put in their other cars. So now they've got like not just a win in Formula One, they've got a win for their business and their core business. Really interesting story. And I love the story about, Apple's goal to get rid of all the buttons on the phones. And like, obviously that worked. It worked. And this is where you really start to use them to power your innovation. So start being more aware of them. Write them on a whiteboard if it's something that's important enough. And now it's a business goal. Write it where your team can see it. We had some space on our roadmap, which I know rarely happens, but we did. And we decided that, you know what? We're going to make sure that the full Scrum team has an opportunity to really contribute some ideas. And it was such a great opportunity because, number one, we actually had the time to work on this stuff. But number two, like, we knew what our goals were. And so we constrained the entire session. We didn't constrain the way they thought or the ideas or any of that. We let them kind of go crazy. And if something was already on somebody's list, we didn't even tell them. We just we just let everybody come out with it. And we came out with, I think it was like something like 40 different ideas. And we went through all the typical product management exercises of figuring out what the impact would be and actually figuring out what the effort would be and started to slot them into sprints. And we did it right away. That's what I meant when I talked about like there's immediate actionable things that you can do. Use them to guide your experimentation strategy. Now you know what to start with, right? And do quarterly check-ins. Are they still real? Are there new ones? Are there things that I didn't think about? Did that one go away? Were we able to really, crack that? Let's see what else. And then retro. Look back and figure out what really happened. Acknowledge your wins. What creative solutions came out? Did it bring the team together? What are you going to try next time? I kind of took a revisit at those definitions that we looked at earlier, and I was like, you could just redefine the whole thing in a positive way. And I think if you consciously, this is really just positive constraints or something that you consciously put upon yourself to put you on a path. So say you want to lose weight and you know that the way to do it is to go on a specific kind of diet. Like, that's a conscious restraint that you've put on yourself. It's a positive conscious restraint. I would think about them a little bit like that. So here's some tips to actually take all that stuff that we just did and get started with them. Number one, jump right in. Start today. And then make it an ongoing practice. Bring it find some way to bring it into your regular work. Make it a group project, not too big a group. Bring it to a product team meeting. If you do have a big product team at your organization, this is a great thing to bring to the full group and say, hey, these are the constraints that my team's really struggling with. What do you guys have on your list? What else did we not think about? How did you solve for these? And that's where you can have those conversations. Keeping track. And then the share and evangelize is super important. One of the reasons I think this is so important, and people forget this, is that this is an opportunity for you to talk about how your team found a win. This is an opportunity for you to say, you know what? We had a problem. We figured out how to fix it. I led the team in fixing it, and here's what we came up with. Please, we want you to know about this. Management team, we want you to know about this because not just because we want a pat on the back, but like it's important to the organization to know that we solved this problem. Maybe they bring it to another team. Maybe they ask you to bring it to another team and show your wins there. I think that's it. Thank you. Yeah.
I loved all the research. That was really cool. I was wondering what sort of like blogs you go through, if you have any that kind of like really create really kind of work, but like when you
Yeah.
going through a blog,
I've been obsessed with Medium. I keep ending up in a paid Medium subscription because there's just been so much great content on there. I feel like in the last year especially. There are great groups that you can follow on there. And that's how I find a lot of things. I think the startup is a great one. I don't know if anybody else has any others that they like, but I find then I start getting the newsletters and then I just get into a rabbit hole. So honestly, that's been my big one lately. I also just use LinkedIn a lot because I'm already following all the companies that I'm interested in, the topics that I'm interested in. You can follow hashtags on there now. So, I think I would say that those are the two most. And then, I get a whole bunch of newsletters from different companies like Product School and Mind the Product and things like that. And there's always interesting stuff in there. Always. Yeah. I think, it's perspective. So it's not just the challenge, it's not just the constraints, but yes, I definitely feel like everything I've learned at every job has taught me something that I can bring into every other job, and constraints is definitely not an exception. Yeah. I think, it also helps you identify things faster. And then I'm actually going to go back a couple slides because this slide, which I really do think is probably like at the core of what we do. This is something you get better at, and you keep getting better at it, and you'll get to the point where you can do it in your head. That's why I was saying, like, this could take months or this could take 15 minutes. You could literally be sitting in a meeting and somebody says something and they're like, well, we can't do that because of this. And your wheels will start turning. You will come up with a solution and you'll be like, well, what if we did this? And then they'll suddenly be like, huh. or maybe they'll poke holes in what your suggestion is, but maybe then you'll come up with another one. We have a lot of compliance things, the regulations that we have to take into consideration at my current role. And I will often, after I've been told, no, you can't do that, I'll leave the room, I'll think about something, and then I'll just kind of walk back over, and while they're still in the room, I'll just lean into the room and be like, what if we did it this way? And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say maybe, and sometimes they say go back to the drawing board. But, it definitely is something that I've gotten better at over the years. So I definitely think it's something that you can take with you. In constraints or in work? I think it was the emotional stuff. I think it was not knowing that it was not knowing that it was in my head. Not knowing that the problem was in my head. It took me longer than I would have liked to figure out that it was an emotional reaction to something that was just a business problem. I mean, I think that's, that probably says more about me than it does about product, but I think it took me a lot of years to figure out, you don't have to get upset just because something's blocking you. You can figure out another way to approach it. No, I think it was somebody looking at me and giving me a look that made me think, oh, this is not okay. The way I'm reacting to this is too big. And I remember it was somebody who said I was upset at a person. So I was upset at a human being because she was, the constraint was something that a third party vendor had put into place, and there was a contract and all that kind of stuff. And she was the messenger. And I reacted harshly, didn't like the way I reacted. That was my wake up. My wake up was, this is not the person I want to be at work. This is not the person I want to be in general. And I need to figure out another way to approach these. Thanks for asking.